Oh, hey, what you doing out there? Come on in. Let me get the garden door for you. So the last time I had you here, we had about 8 inches of snow on the ground. Today it's 85 degrees, all in 2 weeks. Spring has finally arrived. It's time to head inside and take a look at today's readings. So this is the 4th Sunday of Easter now. This is traditionally called the Good Shepherd Sunday. And the reason for that is because it picks up this theme of the Good Shepherd laying down his life for the sheep, or the sacrifice of Christ on the cross at Easter. It is also why we read from John chapter 10 and Psalm 23 during this Sunday. The prayer for this Sunday goes way back, all the way back to the 8th century with the Galatian, however you say that, sacramentary, that reads, Almighty everlasting God, guide us toward the joyful company of heaven, so that our lowly flock may follow where Christ, the great shepherd, has gone before. Good morning. A little bit of an introduction to me. My name is David Paris, and for the past 30 years, I've had the privilege of teaching and doing research at the graduate level for theological studies. And the goal of this channel is to hopefully bring some of those experiences and what I've learned to you. Now, in order to understand John chapter 10, we have to back up into John chapter 9, because John likes to link and interweave his stories together. In John chapter 9, we have the story of the blind man, who Jesus takes, spits in some dirt, makes some clay, rubs it in his eyes, and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. After he washes his eyes, he's healed. Now this poor guy jumps from the frying pan out into the fire. He comes into confrontation with the leadership in the synagogue where he worships. Mainly it's a confrontation over who Jesus is. Is Jesus a righteous man or a sinner? Is he healing people according to the precepts and the patterns set down in the Old Testament? Or is he some sort of miracle worker or false prophet that's operating outside of what we would call good Orthodox theology? Well, he defends Jesus. The religious leaders don't see it that way, and so they excommunicate him. They cast him out of the synagogue. Once he is cast out of the synagogue, then Jesus finds him again. And he's having this face-to-face conversation with the guy. But he doesn't recognize Jesus until Jesus tells him, the one speaking to you is the Messiah. And then this guy makes the confession of good faith. The religious leaders then become highly offended by this. And this is where the point of John chapter 9 comes in. It revolves around this whole issue of whether you can see or you can't see, whether you're blind or you're sighted. Because this is what we would call prototypical metaphor. We use these ideas of being able to see all the time in language to express some sort of recognition or understanding of what we're talking about. Do you see what I'm saying? The Pharisees, in verse 40, said, surely we are not blind, are we? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains. But the blind man is not able to see physically, but he's able to perceive spiritually something about Christ. Now we come to the Pharisees at the very end, who can see physically, but they can't perceive spiritually. In other words, it's their arrogant claim there that also plays into this whole picture about why they are blind and also why their culpability remains. This then leads us into chapter 10, Now, John chapter 10, Jesus' teachings on the Good Shepherd, breaks down into two very neat sections, verses 1 through 6 and then 7 through 16. And so let's tackle these in order. In verses 1 through 6, we get a very straightforward teaching on what a shepherd is. And if you read through that, you'll see that there's really nothing very surprising there at all. So what was typical in that time is shepherds would bring their flock down probably from the fields at night, and into the village or somewhere close to the village there would be a sheepfold. They would put them into this enclosed, this walled enclosure, sheepfold, and then there would be a person there who made their living by basically being the gate, or opening and closing the gate and protecting the sheep during the night. In the morning, the shepherd would then come and then, using whistles or commands or calls, call his sheep out of the sheepfold. And you notice in verse 3 and verse 4, he calls his own, this ta idia. There is a personal relationship between him and his sheep, but it also paints the picture here that there's more than one flock within this sheepfold. He's calling his out of the flock, and then he's got to take them out for the day. Nothing surprising, nothing revolutionary here. But there are a couple ideas that are important here. First off, this idea of calling his sheep. In the Gospel of John, this idea of calling and vocal recognition is very important. We saw this with the blind man. You're going to see this when you go into John chapter 11 with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And I'll put the verses over here so you can read them on your own. As Jesus is coming up to Bethany to raise Lazarus, Martha hears that he is coming and she goes out. After her discussion with Jesus, she goes back to the house and she tells Mary, the teacher is here and he is calling for you. Mary then goes out. Then when we get to the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus just calls Lazarus and he comes out of the tomb. And then when we were looking at the story of Mary Magdalene at the tomb, remember, she looks at Jesus face to face, just like the blind man does. And then she turns around, and it's when she turns around that Jesus calls Mary. And then she recognizes him and she cries out, Rabboni, or teacher, and turns around and you get this big jumping up and down and hugging and touching and all that sort of stuff. But within John's gospel, he really likes to play on this theme of hearing, recognizing the Savior's voice. And we see that in this sheepfold story. The shepherd knows his own, he calls them, and his sheep know his voice, and they follow him. So in John chapter 9, John plays off this whole theme of seeing and understanding, correctly perceiving who Christ is based on sight, and whether you're blind or sighted. In John chapter 10, it's really going to focus around the complementary sense, hearing. Now, so far, this is pretty straightforward teaching. Everybody standing there would have agreed. This is exactly what shepherds and sheep and how that whole economy is carried out. But then in verse 6, it says that they didn't understand this figure of speech he was saying. This is really interesting. It's almost funny because Jesus teaches, I am the light of the world. He tells Nicodemus, you must be born again. He doesn't get that. You have the whole conversation with the blind man and the Pharisees. They think they see, they don't see, they're not perceiving, they're not understanding. In John's gospel, a lot of times, Jesus teaches in these very metaphorical and figurative forms of speech, which people don't understand. He's talking about this, they think it's that. So now in John chapter 10, when he gives this very straightforward teaching, you would think they would get it perfectly clear. But he says they don't understand this figure of speech. Now, I always like to think this is like little kids in a Sunday school class. You know, the teacher's up there and they ask them, what eats nuts, is gray, has a bushy tail, lives in trees? And the little kids look at each other and they start consoling one another. And first kid goes, you know, I really think it's a squirrel. Another kid looks at him too and goes, you know, that's what my guess is, but this is Sunday school class and you know it's always got to be God or Jesus. And they go, I don't know, I think the teacher's trying to trick us here. I really don't understand what the question is at all. And it's kind of like that situation here. Jesus has been using all these very interesting allusions and metaphors to speak about who he is and his saving work. And now he gives this very, very clear, straightforward teaching, and John tells us they don't understand. Now, immediately after this, Jesus is going to give an explanation of what that teaching was about. And he's going to explain it using two metaphors. I am the door, and I am the good shepherd. Now, first, we have to deal with this sweeping statement that Jesus makes in verse 8, where he says, everybody who came before me were thieves or robbers. Now, this is a hyperbole. It's an overstatement. Because we know that John the Baptist and other leaders, for example, Nicodemus and other people that were alive during this time, were not thieves. So let's take a look at this first metaphor, this teaching that I am the gate. Now, in this section, in verse 7, Jesus starts off. He said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the gate, or I am the door for the sheep. Metaphors work by taking something we're familiar with and then applying it to something that we're trying to understand. Now, in this case, Jesus is taking what they were familiar with. Shepherds, sheep, sheepfolds, very, very common stuff in the life of ancient Israel. And he's applying it to help them understand who he is. And he's going to use this concept of I am the gate or I am the door to help us understand this. Now, when he says this, I think it's probably best not to see it as just those planks of wood that are in the middle, because then you run into this interesting metaphorical blend of kind of walking through that piece of wood. But if we see the gate or the door as the whole thing, so you've got the sides, the hinges, and it opens, sort of a gateway or a doorway, I think it helps us grab this metaphor a little bit better. Verse 9, he says, whoever enters by me will be saved. And really, the Greek there in verse 9 is whoever enters through me. So when a person passes through this sort of Jesus door, they then find salvation. Now we've got three other verbs here. So let's take a look at the second one. He says, will come in and go out. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical grammar here, but there's two ways we can read these verbs in Greek. The first is kind of like a simple action. In other words, it's describing salvation. We pass through Jesus for salvation, and then we go out into heaven, or as it concludes there, we'll find pasture, this allusion to our final resting place with Christ, that we go out. I don't think that quite captures what's going on here. This coming in and going out, I think should be read as sort of continuous verbs, ongoing process. And it's going back to this image of the shepherd. Every day the shepherd takes his flocks out to the fields, and then he brings them back to the sheepfold at night. They're constantly coming in and going out of that sheepfold. And I think that's the picture here. So maybe if we bring across the more iterative or the more continuous aspects of these verbs, it brings it across a little bit better. So we would translate this verse then as, whoever goes through me will be saved. And they will be coming in and going out until they find salvation, or until they find pasture. In other words, it's a picture of the Christian life, that we constantly pass through Christ, going into the fold, going out to pasture, being led by the shepherd in and out through this doorway, which is Christ, until we find at the very end that pasture that he's talking about. And that's why also this passage is read in conjunction with Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me into green pastures. One of the reasons why I would argue that John is using the continuous aspect of these verbs, in other words, we go through Christ for salvation, and then we're coming and going through the Christian life. Jesus is leading us, but he's also taking us through this Jesus door continuously into the sheepfold and out to the pastures until we find that pasture. It's the very end where it says that they might have life abundantly. And that's talking about life now, but also the promised life in the future. And so I think this idea of the abundant life is tied into this, going in and out through Jesus, but also his leading and guiding us. Now this is going to bring us into the second metaphor, I am the good shepherd. And I need to back up and just make a small point here, and that is in this passage we have two of the I am statements that are in John's gospel. I am the door and I am the good shepherd. And now we're going to look at the second one here, I am the good shepherd. Now in verses 11 through 15, we got the statement of I am the good shepherd. And I'm going to just read portions of this here. Verse 11, I am the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then in verse 14, I am the good shepherd, I know my own, and my own know me. And the use there of I know my own and my own know me go back to verses 3 and 4 where it's the shepherd knows his sheep and the sheep know him. I am the good shepherd, I know my own and my own knows me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father and I lay down my life for the sheep. Now there's a couple points that I want to bring out here in regard to this passage and what Jesus is talking about the good shepherd. The first off, when he talks about the good shepherd, we could really say that he's constructing an ideal, a perfect shepherd. The first thing within this metaphor of I am the good shepherd is there's a contrast between the good shepherd and the hired hand. In his straightforward teaching in verses 1 through 5, you have a contrast between the shepherd and the thief. Now it's a contrast between the hired hand and the good shepherd. In this passage, though, the hired hand is not a bad person. This is the person that the shepherds paid to watch their flocks in that field at night. But the key thing here is that this hired hand, his only relationship to the sheep in this particular story is the fact that they are paid to watch them. So when something dangerous comes along, their commitment to those sheep is not to the point of laying down their life. The good shepherd, on the other hand, has a completely different relationship with his sheep. The good shepherd will sacrifice himself for the sheep. This is really strange for the ancient world, because if the shepherd was killed, then that flock is in total disarray. They're at whatever forces or animals come along, they can take and ravage that flock, or they can be stolen. So the idea that the good shepherd would lay down his life for the sheep, it raises questions. What's interesting is Jesus has this little flock of 12 apostles, 70 or so disciples, and how many followers? But he is crucified on the cross for his flock. And you would expect, or what the Roman authorities expected, is that by crucifying Christ, it would put a whole end to this Messiah movement. But in reality, just the opposite happened. It started a fire that burned across the face of the Roman Empire. Just as the sheep know the shepherd's voice and the shepherd calls them by name in verses 3 and 4, here in this metaphor, Jesus knows his own and his own know him. There's a personal relationship between the good shepherd and the sheep. And it's not just from the shepherd to the sheep, but the sheep know the shepherd as well. Now, verse 15 is really kind of interesting. We need to take a look at the text here. Notice in verse 14 it says, I am the good shepherd, I know my own and my own know me. Now verse 15, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. This really seems to be jumping outside this metaphorical image here. Where does this whole idea of the Father come in here? Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. And this just as there that he uses is making a direct comparison between the relationship of the shepherd, the good shepherd and the sheep, and the Father and the Son. Now we saw this in the story of Mary Magdalene. Remember in the story of Magdalene, stop holding on to me. I must go to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. In other words, he takes this relationship that he has with the Father and now applies it to his followers. The same thing is seen here as well. The relationship between the sheep and the shepherd is comparable to the relationship between Jesus and the Father. Now we come to verse 16 where I'm going to conclude today. And in this statement, Jesus says that I have other sheep that are not of this flock. Now, all sorts of different groups have made all kinds of wild assumptions about this verse. But I think primarily one that's going back and picking up these ideas of flock and sheep in the Old Testament. Israel was the flock of God. Here, Jesus is saying that I have other sheep that are not of this flock. In other words, he's going to go and gather the Gentiles into this flock. And then in this really nice statement that helps us as non-Jewish believers that have been grafted into this relationship with God, he says, I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, so that there will be one flock, one shepherd. In other words, the Gentiles are not second-rate citizens of the kingdom of God, so that there will be one flock with one shepherd, unity. What is the one qualifying trait that brings all of these sheep together in a true relationship with the shepherd? In verse 16, it says, they will listen to my voice. Now, I like the way John uses this metaphor of listening. You can see somebody else. You could be in a crowded room or a group of people, and you can see someone else, and you might learn something about them. But it's only when you sit and you talk and you engage in conversation with that other person that you really get to know them well. Now, one of the ways to make this channel a little bit more interactive, I've been talking to different publishers and sponsor some book reviews and giveaways. And so the first one I thought would be great. I've got a copy of my book, Reading the Bible with the Giants. It looks at 2,000 years of biblical interpretation and how those who have come before us shape who we are now. In other words, when we read the Bible, it's just not you and the Bible in a two-way dialogue, but there's a three-way dialogue. You, the Bible, and the tradition that you're part of all inform one another. So here's how we are going to give this book away. Underneath the video, there's a section where you can enter comments. But the week I hit 100 subscribers, I'll look back through the comments for the past, let's say, starting this week moving forward. And looking at the comments and the people who give the most thoughtful, engaging comments, I will send this to you free. And notice, it's all wrapped in plastic still, so it is COVID-free. It's not based on the person who gives the most praiseworthy. Oh, this was a wonderful video or something like that. I love this teaching or something like that. It's not based on that. I want to hear thoughtful or engaged comments based on the text and what I've talked about. Anyways, if you want to win a book, drop some comments. My goal here is to really just kind of liven up and have some fun. And I'm really appreciative to the publishers at Wipf and Stock for providing this book, and hopefully looking forward to see what they provide in the future. But it's a way to kind of make this fun and engaging at the same time. I will see you next week, and until then, the peace of the Lord be with you.